If you check the mission statement of your school district, you are bound to find ideas related to students owning their own learning and becoming lifelong learners. These phrases are included because educators do want students to own their own learning. The problem arises when there is an obvious gap between the statement and theory and implementing specific practices that lead to student ownership. The gap between the visionary statement about student ownership and the implementation of student ownership arises because, traditionally, it is the teacher who is in control of almost everything. Students sit back and they learn to wait to be told what, who, when, and how the learning will take place. Waiting students are not students who own their own learning. They are students waiting to be told what to do. So what can teachers actually do to foster student ownership? What are the strategic practices that would lead students to own the learning, that journey, all through their education? How can they close this gap between theory and practice? Taking up this challenge of empowering students forms the basis to profound learning. Ownership is the foundational layer of the profound learning model, and specific strategies and tools have been developed to close the gap between the theory and the practice. Empowering students requires transformational thinking and teaching. So what are these transformational strategies that empower students? In a profound learning classroom, the responsibility for learning is given back to the students. Teachers cannot make students learn anyway. Learning happens when the biology of the brain changes, when neurons are fired and new connections are made. Learning happens right within an individual. Teachers have to find ways to allow that biological change to happen and to let the students take the responsibility for that learning. Profound learning provides students with a framework for knowing the curriculum outcomes and tracking the specific learning outcomes required. These outcomes are written in student-friendly language and present the big picture. This structure puts the curriculum into the hands of the student. We call this structure a capacity map because it maps out the learning requirements and gives students the responsibility for tracking their capacity to know the outcome at a very deep level. By tracking, students are now able to see their own learning gaps and are given the power to make improvements. They get to see the gaps and they get to close the gaps. With this structure, teachers have transformed the responsibility for learning to the students. Now you have student ownership. Profound learning provides students with a framework for creating an engaging context for learning. It's the teacher's responsibility to create a context for learning that is engaging and relevant and adventure, something new, exciting, and worthwhile. Meaning is what fires the neurons, so giving students meaningful and engaging work allows them to be self-motivated. When students are self-motivated, you have transferred the responsibility for learning to the students. Now you have student ownership. Profound learning provides students with a framework for allowing for choice and control in the steps to get to those expected outcomes. Power and control motivate. Powerlessness is an awful feeling, and students often feel that they have no control over what is done to them at school. Students will own what they choose. So providing choice in the steps of a project will immediately foster student empowerment. Choice gives students some control. By allowing students to have control over their learning, they begin to see the value in making decisions about their own learning. Self-motivation goes way up as students experience this empowerment. Instead of their success being based on pleasing the teacher or even their parents, students now have the opportunity to choose their own path to success. Now you have student ownership. Profound learning provides students with a framework for using tools and processes to inform their learning. Data diaries and journals, tracking maps, personal reflection tools give students deep insight into their learning. Students take responsibility for their learning when they have data that informs, data that goes beyond a percentage grade on a test. When students learn to use a variety of tools that build their work to quality, and inform them on their progress, teachers have once again transferred the responsibility for learning to the students. Now you have student ownership. Ownership and empowerment applies to both teachers and students. Teachers have responsibilities, and so do students, but the perspective around these responsibilities is shifting in a profound learning classroom. If we just keep these 4 ideas at the forefront of our teaching practice, we will have transformed our classrooms into a profound learning environment. Structure drives behavior. Transforming structure will transform behavior. The 4 structures just described will transform teaching and learning in your classroom, so here they are again. Ownership is achieved by letting students know and track the specific learning outcomes required. Ownership is achieved by having teachers create an engaging context for learning, an adventurous experience for students. Ownership is achieved by allowing for students to have choice and control in the steps to get to those expected outcomes. And 4th, ownership is achieved by using tools and processes to inform their learning so that students have the data they need to set goals for success. Profound learning, teaching, and learning practices go beyond improvement. They become transformational. Student ownership and empowerment brings the joy back into teaching.